Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the game between the Sharks and the Bruins, in which the Sharks lost 4-1. Now, technically, they have lost both games to the Bruins during their season series against them, 0-1-1 if you count the overtime loss as a separate entity. 1 point of a possible 4 points, I guess, would be the easiest way to put it. And I thought the Sharks were going to come out with a much better performance than they had in that first game against the Bruins. And I thought the first few minutes of the first period were at least pretty good for the San Jose Sharks. Then the Bruins brought it back. It was some pretty fast hockey, some chances either way, until the Sharks on the power play do get the first goal of this one, up 1-0. But after that, the Bruins just completely took over. The Sharks basically had no chance. They were just pushed out of this game. Krejci with the goal on the power play of his own, but so many other great chances. It could have easily been like 3-1, possibly 4-1 at the end of the first period. The Sharks were lucky to escape with a tie, and you'd think they'd capitalize on that by coming out with a good second period, but instead, the Sharks are completely lifeless again, and the Bruins are the team that gets 3 goals. They add McAvoy, DeBrusk, and a shorthanded goal from Marchand, and it's 4-1 by the end of the second period. Coming into the third period, the Sharks seem more interested in fighting than they do in trying to actually stage some sort of comeback in this game. They get Kane versus Chara fight. They get Goodrow versus Wagner, as well as a Haley versus Backus fight. And the Sharks, meanwhile, are putting up 0 shots on net until finally all of that passes. But it was soon too late. The Sharks do end up pulling the goalie in the last 3 or so minutes of the game. They don't really get too much generated, and they lose this one 4-1. And this was a pretty disappointing finish to this road trip. Besides the Penguins game, which was a great game for the Sharks, 4-0 shutout win, you take a look at the Blue Jackets game, the Red Wings game, and now tonight's against the Bruins, and you take a look at the 9 periods of hockey, you could very much make the argument that about 7.5 of those periods were not good at all. Some of the worst periods the Sharks have played, because they were not good at all in the Blue Jackets game, all three periods. They weren't good here tonight against the Bruins, all 3 periods, and they did not have a good first or a good start to the second against the Red Wings. And so only about 30 minutes out of a possible 180 minutes were actually some good periods of hockey for the San Jose Sharks. So they're definitely lucky to be coming back home now, and hopefully they can pick up the play with these couple of days off that they do have. First thing to talk about is Martin Jones, who I had pointed out in the first matchup against the Boston Bruins as having a pretty bad game. Tonight, I thought it was a bit weirder. I pointed out that the Sharks could have been trailing 3-1 or 4-1 by the end of the first period. And the major reason why they weren't is because Martin Jones was coming up with some pretty big saves. And yet the one goal he did let into Krejci was quite weak, honestly. A one-timer here, but it's going 5-hole, so it's not some sort of great shot. Maybe it fooled Jones, but it's not the worst thing in the world, and I'm not going to fault him too much, because if it's not that one, it's probably a different one that should have gone in, and you would normally say Jones would have no chance on them. But some nice saves on that many odd man rushes that the Sharks did give up. Come second period, though, he couldn't really keep up with that. Didn't have too much of a chance on the McAvoy one. No chance on the DeBrusk one. The Marchand one was just a terrible choice by him. First of all, we have Erik Karlsson, who shouldn't have been on the ice in the first place, getting deked out by Marchand. Jones decides to go for the poke check for whatever reason, even though every time he's gone for the poke check this season, it has not worked out. But he does it anyway. He gets punished for this one. Easy goal for Marchand after that. And Jones was making some pretty good saves all through this game, so I won't say it was bad, and I thought he was one of the better Sharks, I guess you could say, in this game, but still it wasn't a very good night here for the Sharks starting goaltender. Next is Nyquist, as I will, of course, mention him. Normally, I don't like to bring up anything good about players after a bad loss like this, but because it's Nyquist's first game, I will mention the fact that I thought he was actually decent. His first period, he didn't really get to do much. His second period, I thought he got some decent chances. I thought even in the third period, after we got past the periods of basically no chances at all for the San Jose Sharks in the last 8 or so minutes, Nyquist actually got a couple of decent moments, but I thought he was pretty good for the Sharks. I knew it was going to be some sort of adjustment period here for him, and it seems like that is the case, but he was one of the better Sharks here tonight, so I guess that's a good sign moving forward, and we'll see what line he ends up in the next few games, because he was here with Thornton and LeBanc tonight, which was a pretty good line, honestly, at least in comparison to the others, which were quite bad. This was probably their best line, even if it wasn't that good. But this was also something that came about because Marcus Sorensen is still injured. Once Sorensen does return from injury, it'll be interesting to see where he slots in. Next is Erik Karlsson. Of course, I mentioned earlier that Erik Karlsson should not have been on the ice for the Marchand goal, and that wasn't because I thought Erik Karlsson shouldn't be playing the power play when, in this situation. It was because Erik Karlsson, halfway through the second period, leaves with what appears to be a re-aggravation of his groin injury, goes to the dressing room, comes back a few minutes later. You can tell that he's still not 100%, that he still shouldn't be back, and again, plays a few minutes. He gets deked out on this goal from Marchand and then doesn't come out for the third period. So I have no idea what is going on with this injury. Karlsson even said himself that he could have potentially played the Red Wings game, but the Sharks were being extra cautious, and yet he's back in this Bruins game when he's clearly not 100%. He comes back after he obviously is in pain from re-aggravating this injury some point in the second period, and it's, again, not a cautious move. So we're getting some mixed signals here. I don't know if it's the coaching staff who's saying, Erik Karlsson, you need to get back onto the ice. I feel like that's unlikely, and I feel like it's more likely that it's Erik Karlsson himself, certainly a competitor, that he wants to get back onto the ice. But at this point, I think you have to sit him down and just shut him down here for at least the next, couple of weeks, because he hasn't looked 100% since his return from injury. And if you count the fact that he could have been sitting this entire time, maybe he could have been fully healed by this next game against the Avalanche on Friday, and he would have only missed an extra 6 or 7, and the Sharks haven't even looked terrible when Karlsson has been out of the lineup. Next is Evander Kane, who I will point to in particular as having a pretty disastrous game, honestly. Some bad giveaways in the first period especially, went offside on a good shorthanded rush, missed passes everywhere, just seemed completely out of sync with everybody on the team. Not to say that everyone around him was playing so well and Kane was the one dark horse here, or the one black sheep, I should say, but he did have a pretty noticeably worse game. But I guess in a typical Evander Kane fashion, he still finds a way to make some sort of impact with the physical maneuvers that he does pull off. He gets a hit to the head here from Zdeno Chara, and apparently Zdeno Chara might be facing some sort of player safety calls, depending on if the pendulum will swing the right way and get him suspended. But Kane doesn't like it because it didn't seem like there was going to be a penalty at first, so he jumps Chara. Very aggressive move here from Evander Kane, but he decides to do it. Doesn't really energize the bench at all. The two other fights that the Sharks get into doesn't energize the bench at all. So I guess that's something good, that Evander Kane, even when he's having a horrific game, one of his worst of the seasons, he does still find a way to make an impact, you could say, but still not a great game from number 9. Finally, I will talk about the commentators, not the Sharks, as again, I got to listen to the Boston Bruins commentators, and I never mention commentators, or I very rarely mention the commentators. I think the only other time I did was the other game against the Boston Bruins, but these two commentators just completely drive me up the wall with the amount of disrespect they show. I'm a fan. I'm not any way affiliated to the NHL, so I have the right to say that this player didn't play well, and I have the right to say that Michael Haley is not a good hockey player, because it's basically true. But when it comes to two commentators who are very well respected by the NHL, and they're employed by the Boston Bruins, who are of course an NHL team, the fact that they go out and say that Michael Haley is not a good hockey player, not that he wasn't playing well in this particular night, not that he hasn't played well in the past couple of games, but the fact that they literally say that he's not a good hockey player. They say something along the lines of, Michael Haley's hands of stone, we've seen him miss the puck a few times, he's not good. It's just so disrespectful to do that if you're in such a position of authority here in NHL standards. And I know that nothing in terms of consequences is going to come down to them, but I just thought it left a bad taste in my mouth that they would say something like that about another NHL player. And just in general, I thought they were quite disrespectful here tonight. I know the Sharks weren't playing very well, but still, it's just something to mention. I won't bring up commentators too often, and luckily against the Sharks are not going to be playing against the Boston Bruins at any point until the Stanley Cup Finals, if that. At which point it won't be the Boston Bruins Boston Bruins commentators commentating that. So it will be the last I hear of them of this season, and that's thankfully for me, I guess I could say. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Friday. As I said, they will play against the Colorado Avalanche. They will be back at home. The first meeting between these two teams, the Sharks had a 5-1 lead, almost gave that up. The Avalanche pulled it to within 5-4 before losing. The Sharks will look to get back into the win column after a pretty disastrous end to this road trip, and will also look to put the Avalanche away if they do get a lead, much better than they have done in the previous game. Class dismissed.